Everybody, my name is Jeff Johnson. I'm the Chief Design Officer over here at Nested Knowledge. I'm playing a little bit of moderator today. I know we promised you Greg Martin. He's MIA, so we're just we're going forward with this webinar as it stands. We have two great guests today and two co-founders of two different evidence synthesis platforms, both with AI capabilities, and we're going to talk about AI in evidence synthesis today. I want to reserve a little bit of time at the beginning of this webinar to introduce everyone. So let's just have everybody introduce themselves. Again, my name is Jeff Johnson. Robby, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks everyone for inviting me for this. I'm Robby Nieuwlaat. I'm an associate professor at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada. And I primarily work on evidence synthesis and health guideline development. And with that, some implementation research and clinical epidemiology. And happy to present some of our work today.
Nancy, go ahead.
Sure. Well, first off, it's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. My name is Nancy Hedlund. I am the founder and principal consultant of a consultancy by the name of MedNavigate. We work with pharmaceutical, medical device, and diagnostic companies to help them with their health economic, real-world evidence, and economic strategies. So certainly literature is key to all of these applications. I've been a Nested Knowledge user for about 1.5 years. And I've used the technology for structured reviews as well as for a number of targeted scoping exercises. So I'm really excited to be here with you today, talk about the use of AI and really contemplate how use of AI may augment my practice as I work with different companies.
Excellent. Keith, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm the founder and president of Nested Knowledge, evidence synthesis platform, obviously augmented by AI, hence the topic of the webinar. I have a background actually in consulting and medical device development before I got into software. Basically, those two informing the need, as Nancy was saying, every life science company needs this. It's relying on literature for clinical, HEOR, regulatory reimbursement, clinical even. And with all the new technologies emerging, they can do it a lot faster and better, which is great because there's a ever-growing body of evidence that they need to synthesize. So I'll hand it back to you, Jeff.
Absolutely. Archer, certainly last but not least, tell us a little bit about yourself, the few platforms that you founded, the two of them, and yeah, great.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all. And my name is Artur Novak. I am co-founder of Evidence Prime. As Jeff told you already, we developed two platforms. The first one is GradesPro, which is a very popular platform for guideline development, used by more than 100,000 people in the world right now. And the second one, which will be the topic of today's call, is LaserAI, which is for living systematic reviews, hence the name, but with also the semi-automation coming from the AI. So my background is in computer science. Indeed, my master thesis was on building a vertical search engine for academic papers. So you can tell that I'm working on this problem and in this field for some time already. But for the last 10 years, I enjoyed working with researchers from all around the world on evidence synthesis and also guideline development.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, so before we dive into our speaker presentations today, I want to let you, the audience, know that this is really reliant on your audience participation. I want to answer your questions about AI in evidence synthesis today, regardless of which platform you use, regardless of which discipline you work in, whether you're an academic, whether you're working in industry. Shoot us your questions, basically. We are live on multiple platforms simultaneously, but your questions will come into us and we will answer them, as many of them as we can today, as we move through these presentations and talk a little bit about the current state of AI in evidence synthesis, as well as where we're all headed. So with that said, feel free to drop your comments in whatever platform that you're watching us on today. Robby, why don't you feel free to just share your screen, and then we will tell us a little bit about your experience using
start sharing here. All right,
Okay.
can you see that?
We can. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So yeah, again, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's great to be here and discuss some of this work and also to hear from others. I will just give a short presentation about some of the work we have been doing to give you some insight, but I'm sure there will be some questions about that I cannot go into all the details, so that's fine. So we can take any questions afterwards. So I'm presenting on the use of LaserAI, so Evidence Prime's software to perform a living systematic review for the purpose of informing guideline development. So, and again, this is what we do a lot with our group. And before I go into those details, so just some disclosures for myself. As I mentioned, I'm at McMaster University. I'm leading the Michael G. DeGroot Cochrane Canada Center. We have Cochrane Canada in our university, in our department. I'm also leading online programs called Graduate Diploma Clinical Epidemiology, and I'm doing I have a leading role in the InGuide program for health guideline development. And I'm a great working group member. And Arthur also mentioned GradePro, which is software that integrates a lot of these methodologies that we use for guideline development, and our group uses that software for every project, basically, in terms of guideline development. So what I'm presenting on is work we did with the funded by the American Society of Hematology, and we performed the work with a large group of our own team, our researchers, but collaborating with hematology experts through the American Society of Hematology. And so I will show what we did for our evidence synthesis and our guideline development. And then I will also show some slides that Tamara Lotfi led in terms of analyzing some of the performance of the algorithm, the machine learning that we applied using LaserAI for this process. So here you can see one of the publications that came out of this work. So we developed with the American Society of Hematology several recommendations for the use of anticoagulation, so blood thinners, to prevent thrombosis, thromboprophylaxis in patients with COVID-19. And this was specifically for patients who were hospitalized, either critically ill or acutely, but not critically ill. And we also had one recommendation for patients who were leaving the hospital. So this was all, of course, especially relevant for the early pandemic when a lot of patients were in the hospital. So these were urgent questions that needed to be answered. And so that's why we worked on that with, let's say, a rapid timeline and with the intention to have a living systematic review to keep updating the evidence as new evidence came out. So these are in a simple way to show you the steps that we took. So we looked for two types of evidence primarily. So one was, of course, for comparative studies that looked at how effective is a higher dose of blood thinners anticoagulation as compared to the more traditional lower dose of blood thinners. Because during the pandemic, a lot of physicians started to use higher doses because they saw more thrombosis, blood clots in these patients in the hospital. So that's why they wanted to increase the doses. We had to look for studies that compared the different doses to see if it was actually more effective. But another piece to this, for us to be able to answer that, was to look for evidence that we call baseline risk evidence, which indicates what exactly is the risk in these patients. So if you take 1,000 of these hospitalized patients, what is really the rate of having a venous thromboembolism, as we call it, or a blood clot in the lungs or in the legs? Other outcomes were major bleedings or mortality that are relevant in hospitalized patients. But this type of evidence we looked for with a separate systematic review. And this is the review that we applied the LaserAI and the algorithm to. So we did manual screening of all the results we initially found, and I'll show you the numbers in a bit. And then our team screened that, identified relevant studies, and then we used that to train the machine learning classifier, so with Arthur and Evidence Prime. And following that, the application of that classifier, we then screened the top 5,000 citations based on the classifier to reduce the amount of work and not having to go through all citations that we identified. So these were the steps we went through. And just to clarify, so we did not have a specific cutoff for the classifier itself, so no specific value that was predetermined to be, let's say, most useful to identify citations while not being concerned about missing anything important. We drew the line at 5,000 for feasibility because we had to be fast. We had a lot of citations that were identified with our searches, and this is the decision that was made to move forward in this project. And but as I said, the results with every update, the results were used to update the classifier. So if we completed one update, the first update, the initial results plus these update results were then used to further train the classifier, which presumably would then improve it as we go forward. And we were able to more accurately identify those studies that were relevant for this purpose to determine the baseline risk of these patients. So we did an analysis, as I said, led by Tamara Lotfi, and we wanted to assess post hoc, so after we went through this systematic review process, the performance and efficiency of the classifier in ranking studies based on how likely it was that they were included for these specific outcomes of venous thromboembolism, so that's VTE. Again, that's a blood clot in the lungs or in the legs. And the clock is shown here, or the stopwatch is shown here, because of course speed was of the essence, and that was part of our evaluation. So this graph has a bit more information, so I have to make sure I walk you through this step by step. So you can see on the left, we did our initial search in August of 2020, which identified 12,500 citations. So we did our manual screening and we used those results to train the classifier. Then we did our first update in March of 2021, which we applied the same search strategy and we identified over 32,000 citations. So you can, first of all, this shows you how fast this body of evidence was developing. There were many publications coming out for this specific topic. And so the classifier was applied. We identified the top 5,000 classified studies or with the highest classifier score. We then manually screened those 5,000. And again, we used those results for our purpose to determine baseline risks. And then in the next step, so in another update, we ran our search again. We had 74,000 citations identified. Again, we applied the classifier, we trained it with now including the first update results. Again, screened the top 5,000 for this second update. And then we finished our process of screening and including studies for this second update. So you can see here also in these steps, and especially for this second update, where we it's a little bit small, but where we applied or where we analyzed how well this worked. And you can see at the top for classifier prioritized citations for the second update, we took a 5% sample and we evaluated performance metrics. And also after finishing our manual screening for the second update, we assessed the performance metrics. So this is the process we evaluated. And this highlights the two steps that we evaluated again. So this slide shows you per step what we screened, what was excluded for the validation study. So this is the work again that we did post hoc to see how well our process worked using the classifier. So we had almost 3,500 titles and abstracts that were used for the validation. Most of them were excluded. There were some potentially eligible, but after full text screening, only 192 would be eligible for our living systematic review. So there were some citations that were initially not in our top 5,000 that would be eligible for the review. But then we also analyzed by not having these studies, these were the studies that were included, my correction, sorry. But most of them reported non-VTE outcomes. And our main purpose was to identify or determine by only screening the top 5,000 and not the rest of the citations, did we miss anything important? And we were primarily interested in clinical events, and our main outcome was venous thromboembolism. And in our validation study, we showed that we did not miss any studies that reported on this specific outcome of venous thromboembolism. There were a lot of studies that reported on mortality, maybe some other outcomes that were relevant for our recommendations, but this primary outcome was not missed. So for us, that was a good confirmation that we did not miss anything important. So you can see here, the key message is the sample guided by the machine learning classifier was reliable and did not compromise the screening results, specifically for the outcome of venous thromboembolism. And LSR, just to clarify, is living systematic review. In terms of efficiency, because this was, of course, a very important aim for us, to be fast, to be efficient, to save time by using this approach. And we calculated by not having to screen those tens of thousands of citations that we found with our searches, but focusing on those top 5,000 using the classifier, saved us about 214 working days if we calculated it all together for these different steps. And so the key message is semi-automation of screening at the title and abstract level was efficient, and it's especially important in a living systematic review to inform guidelines, and I would add to that for a rapidly evolving topic such as the COVID pandemic, where there was a huge amount of evidence coming out. So that's a short overview of the study that we did. So our initial systematic review and the evaluation we did afterwards. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions you have based on what I've presented here.
Thank you so much, Robby. As I mentioned at the top of this segment, feel free to just enter your questions into the chat interface in whatever platform you are watching us on today, and we will get to them in the order in which they come in. We'll answer as many as we can, that sort of thing. Couple of questions for you, Robby, here. So you mentioned that time was of the essence in this, and I totally understand where you're coming from here. You're going to do upwards of tens of thousands of screening decisions. In your case, your final iteration there is 75,000 records, right? That is just so many records. It's borderline infeasible, especially for a small team. But when you add in this machine learning component to help you make those decisions and prioritize your screening decisions, obviously it becomes feasible, and you can do some really good work very quickly. What was the deadline for the team to complete the review? This question comes from Shelby.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for the question, and Shelby. So the American Society of Hematology contracted our group to do this, let's say, as fast as possible, as anything in the early pandemic, right? So a lot of efforts were, a lot of resources were directed towards that topic. And of course, guidance was needed as fast as possible, because we're talking about people who were hospitalized with COVID-19, who were critically ill or acutely ill, of which there were many. So there was let's say no specific deadline, but we were working on 5 recommendations, and the first ones really had to come out within 3 to 4 months. So we were talking about guidance that was really urgently needed, because a lot of physicians, health professionals were applying higher doses of these blood thinners, assuming that this was needed because they saw more thrombosis in these patients, but the evidence was not clearly summarized, and it was not clear whether that was actually more effective, or if the net benefit was really there for these patients. So that it was really urgently needed. So we were talking more about a couple of months rather than a longer duration.
Right. Certainly not 214 days, right? Like you need to get these decisions in quickly, these guidelines in quickly. Can I just ask you just another general question here? what is the attitude, and I want to ask Nancy this maybe as well, but I think it's particularly relevant to the work that you've done, Robby. What is the attitude of peer reviewers towards papers where AI is used as a tool? And maybe you can talk about that in terms of guidelines as well. Are they well received?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So in terms of peer reviewers, so we have published our recommendations, so the guidelines themselves, and we have mentioned that this was part of our methodology, but I have the impression that those clinical reviewers didn't pay a lot of attention to that because we specifically used it for our purpose to determine the baseline risk for these events. So I would say in practice, it's hard to say, but I think what would be a potential concern is that if, on the one hand, if you get, let's say, clinical experts, of course, who know all the ins and outs about the topic, they may not completely understand what the machine learning approach entails or what you exactly did with this approach and what the benefits and potential limitations are. If, on the other hand, you would have an AI specialist reviewer, they may completely understand that, but they may not really understand why we made some of these decisions that are, let's say, not 100%, a clean AI type of research, but we had to make some decisions based on feasibility to get clinical guidance out very fast, which an AI specialist with maybe not that clinical insight may not completely understand. But again, this is hypothesizing. We haven't experienced that.
Absolutely. There's a cross-disciplinary aspect to putting together a platform like this, and then even using a platform like this. I know it's been a challenge for me working on the UX of Nested Knowledge to figure out how to explain all of the metrics that our robot screener can put out there and make sure that our users understand that and how that works. And it's just a really interesting intersection there. I want to hop over to our next guest. First of all, so thank you so much, Robby. Really interesting presentation. Let's hop over to Nancy Hedlund here. Nancy, tell us a little bit about your experience using Nested Knowledge. Now, I know you haven't had a chance to dive into sort of our next gen AI features, but you've been using our platform for a year and a half. Tell us about that experience and tell us a little bit about what you do as well.
Sure. And if you don't mind, I'd like to add on just quickly to the question posed to Robby.
Go ahead.
I have not had direct experience yet with reviewers with AI as well, but I certainly would anticipate reviewers to be curious, wanting to understand what's possible, not necessarily to the point where they're going to trust 100% AI solution, but certainly see the need and be interested in an AI complemented solution. So certainly if the human and the AI agree substantially, I think that's going to weigh positively. But the market's moving, the market's kind of adapting. And I think that brings me to my practice as well. So I have spent time working in industry in roles of real evidence science, as well as in an HEOR capacity. I've also worked in industry and professional services and technical product implementation with different customers, hospitals in particular, on the adoption curve. Today, a lot of my work with industry focuses on both strategy and tactics. Strategy is things like trying to help an industry customer, be it a pharmaceutical or medical device, determine the most appropriate endpoints to include in a clinical trial to be able to satisfy both regulatory and reimbursement authorities. So historically, I think, companies got very good at what do I need to have in my trial for safety and efficacy, which are the key pillars of, at least in the US, the FDA. And, certainly international authorities have similar key pillars. More recently, companies have become much more sophisticated and also thinking about what endpoints do I need to have for reimbursement. And so one of the ways I used the technology initially when I was first a customer was to do a search of studies out there with patient-focused outcome endpoints. So my assignment was to help a company think about what instruments may they want to include and what patient-related endpoints, both in terms of response to instruments, as well as health service utilization to include in the trial. So in that case, it was a structured review versus a systematic, but still included, certainly inclusion and exclusion criteria. The screening module of the tool is very helpful. And then the tagging module for really sorting out and identifying the different endpoints and doing it in a rapid fashion. So that's one use case I've had for the tool. I certainly use the tool on a regular basis for scoping reviews as I'm bidding out projects. So, unlike the case just discussed where we had, 70,000 citations and, weeks and months to review it. If I'm bidding out a proposal, I typically have 5 to 10 days to turn something around. And I need to have an understanding of what's out there in the literature within 1 to 2 days. So certainly I've used the platform on a number of occasions to do quick searches, create quick hierarchical tree diagrams of the key endpoints that are necessary, and to begin to categorize the data. The technology is extremely helpful in terms of speed of finding the endpoints within a study and getting them into an organized hierarchical structure where I can generate a report. So certainly, as mentioned, I'm getting up to speed on the newer technologies and really excited to try it out. But you've certainly had the PICO identifier, the suggested terms in the platform for a period of time. And all of those tools can help make things quicker. And for me, working with industry, especially with some of the targeted scoping reviews, speed is of the essence. If it's for a proposal, I've got a short period of time to turn it around. If it's for guiding development of a research protocol, like a retrospective study or a manuscript I'm going to write, I've also got a relatively short time to get an essence of the topic. That's not going to mean I'm an expert per se, but to get an essence to be a sophisticated scientist, to be able to participate collaboratively with teams. So I see a whole number of use cases for the platform with and without current AI technology as I interact with industry, either as an embedded scientist, interacting with either their contract research organizations or their deployed teams, say in India, China, or otherwise, that are doing some of the systematic reviews, as well as when I interact on more of a strategic consultancy basis.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So a couple questions in the chat here. So we have Percy. Hello from Luxembourg. We are currently using for the first time NK for one of our projects on toxicology and ecotoxicology. We're having thousands of references found, and we are a bit struggling with the screening. This sounds super interesting to apply and be more efficient for our screening. So yeah, to Percy out there, I'm sorry to hear that you're struggling. This is tough. This is really, really hard stuff. And I would just encourage you to reach out to NK support if you're in our platform already. And we would be happy to show you how to use like our robot screening tool and to help you speed up that process, because yeah, thousands of records is a lot of records, especially if you're working in a small team. If you're collaborating with a small team, obviously NK and LaserAI are going to allow you to do screening in a team setting where you've got multiple reviewers looking at these records and speeding up that process. But layering in the AI piece on top of that is key if you're on a tight deadline, or if you need to get guidelines out. Yeah, Percy's saying we are 4 in the project. Absolutely, there's just 4 people there. So obviously that's still going to help you if you're just thinking about making sure that everybody can be working at the same time on the same set of records in a single screening mode. But obviously we also have these dual screening modes. We have this robot screener, which can help you prioritize your records and also make some of those decisions for you, replacing one of your reviewers. Nancy, I want to turn to you as well and ask you a couple of questions about your experience using the platform to support your customers and their decision-making processes in terms of strategy in general. So first of all, in your consultancy, I know you do a little bit of work with R&D and that sort of thing, RWE and RWD, and also in determining endpoints for clinical trials. Talk a little bit about what that process looks like when you are trying to answer those questions really quickly.
Sure. So I can answer twofold. One, if you think about a clinical trial, certainly we're very interested in what instruments have been utilized across trials. So utilizing the tool to identify published studies from comparative clinical trials and to build out a hierarchy, trying to understand which instruments were used across which trials and get that information summarized. So that's a relatively straightforward approach. The other area where it's important is when you're developing retrospective research protocols. So unlike a clinical trial where you're able to control what endpoints you collect, when you're developing a retrospective protocol, you're depending upon what's been done previously, either in what's been collected in terms of daily clinical practice, that might be an EMR, what's been billed, that might be in claims, as well as what's been reported in other clinical trials. So certainly, as you think about designing a retrospective research study, your inclusion and exclusion criteria, certainly you want to have guided by what's been done previously, as well as what's available. Same thing with your endpoints. So targeted literature searches, again, they may not be 100% complete and with as much rigor as a systematic review discussed. But certainly if you've got a limited amount of time to get a team up to speed and talking on the same page, a targeted literature search can really help get the conversation going and can help pull out what are the comparators that we need to be aware of, as well as what are the methods we need to be aware of when we do a project. That's where nested knowledge has been really helpful. It's, sometimes when I scope out a project, I'll scope out a traditional targeted literature review. In fact, I do in most projects is an early stage. And sometimes there's both timeline and sticker shock in terms of, well, we've done some of that. We understand that, perhaps this background section from a previous protocol might be good enough to keep us moving. And so one of the things that I continue to preach is the importance of using literature to get things right the first time. And so it's always tempting to save time, save money up front, but it can also bite you in the back end when you missed newer or changing practices. So I really like to use the software for targeted searches, particularly in areas to identify what's more recent or in areas where I think there might be some controversy to guide conversations when I work with internal teams on different research projects.
Great answer. Great answer. I want to turn to some just more general. So thank you for your presentation, Nancy. Appreciate it. Some more general questions about AI and just in these two platforms. I think these questions are going to be kind of more for Keith and Artur. So in your experience, at creating these two tools, what are some of the main challenges you've encountered when integrating these AI features into the evidence synthesis process, for your clients? And then how have you kind of overcome some of those challenges? I think we can start with Artur.
Thanks. How much time do you have? Because this question really touches on.
And it's very broad. Take it however you like, in whichever direction. Yeah.
Yeah. So clearly, building a tool for literature reviews for evidence synthesis in 2024 is really about integrating AI. I think it's really beyond a question that at this point, it's not really about supporting the workflows and so on, but actually thinking about how to make AI useful. At the same time, there is so much hype around ChatGPT and all this technology that sometimes people come to us and just assume that this problem should already be solved, right? Because this technology is so powerful. And I believe that what is really interesting is some work that people do. So there is a group at Harvard University that explores, how AI is used by highly skilled workers, like, for instance, the consultants from BCG. There is one such study. And what turns out to be interesting is that when you consider the joint performance of this human and AI tandem, it turns out that sometimes you don't really want to have AI to be too smart, because then people kind of turn out to be not vigilant enough and not pay attention to the situations in which the AI can be wrong. So I think that, first and foremost, we need to find a way for the AI and to kind of complement human intelligence. So we really take a lot of time to think about how to integrate this in such a way to really help people and not to really make them work more. But this time they, instead of just reading the paper, they are reading the paper and the suggestions or some output from the machine, because it's really kind of counterproductive. And also on the same note, thinking about, let's say, this psychological impact of having AI in the tool. And if any of you are of the audience are interested in this particular topic, there is a great study from the group that I mentioned called Falling Asleep at the Wheel about this particular topic. So yeah.
I find that side of things very fascinating, Arthur, as I think about the UX of NK. We've also had a lot of client feedback to that regard too. You know, like, hey, can you blind us from this? Oh wait, can you show us this particular metric? I want to see it. So it cuts both ways pretty deeply, pretty quickly. Keith, same question.
I love Arthur's answer. I'm going to give a concrete example. I was talking to a pharma company yesterday and showing them, oh, you know, you could save so much time in the AI, getting some suggestions or using half of it as the robot screener. And they said, okay, but do you have data on how impacted human decision making is by the fact that they're using AI? And here's the problem. I don't even see how you can quantify that, right? Even with blinding, maybe knowing that your counterpart is a robot and like dual screening, how does that impact people psychologically? Maybe it makes them more vigilant because they're worried that the AI is going to underperform and they're the only humans going to see it before it goes to adjudication. Maybe it's slowing them down, or maybe they assume the AI is going to perform extremely well and they don't even have to worry about it and they can just sort of click through. So I don't know. I don't have good data on how humans working with AI impacts human behavior, but I'm absolutely sure it does. I will also say, I think AI has been a motivating force for the adoption of good systems. So when we started implementing NK with AI, it generated a lot of interest in the platform, obviously, from a time savings perspective. But it also made our current users, I would say, more diligent in making sure everything was structured before they deployed the AI, because once you deploy it, you know, you're just kind of along for the ride, like Arthur said, looking at the suggestions, and it's hard to go back on that. So I would posit, maybe this is too optimistic, but I would posit that using AI in a platform will enable the humans to focus more on the administrative and structural level, while the AIs are finding the individual text segments or screening on robotically for those articles. So that's my optimistic take. My pessimistic take would be people stop actually doing their jobs and they start just trusting whatever the AI says. And as we all know, it's not perfect. There are so many errors that come up using AI, and it's hard to even trace exactly why it made that error. I was screen sharing again on this same call. I said, oh, this looks good, this looks good, this looks good. And then this one auto extraction was like, not relevant in the slightest. Like, no human would ever make that mistake. And they were asking me, why did the AI pull that out? I'm like, I have no idea. It's a black box to me, right? So that would be my pessimistic take, is people stop doing their jobs because they assume the AI will do it for them.
If I can jump in there, I would like to think about how AI might help us in iterations with the development process. So as I'm listening to you speaking, you know, certainly you're talking about AI after, you know, the protocol has been developed and you're applying it. Sometimes the development process is not black and white. And, you know, what I'm going to think about is with my blinders on, based on my understanding of the disease. But while I haven't had the experience doing this yet, I'd really like to try out how AI could make me be a better scientist through iterations in the development process. Because certainly AI may call out some things that I haven't thought about. Some of them may be, you know, off base and we'll just quickly discard them. But perhaps there's also the capability can help us be smarter and stronger by pulling in things that we hadn't thought about. So, you know, kind of two ends to the coin. It's certainly AI is learning, AI is improving. I think I shared with you an example of how AI for meeting notes. It's, you know, I'm experimenting using that as well. And there's ways that can be really helpful. It's, you know, certainly with the action items, AI can do a great job getting a list. When it comes to kind of summarizing the intent of the meeting, not so much, you know, pretty bland, pretty, you know, not there. That cognitive piece is not there yet, but it's evolving. And so I see AI in literature search and science being the same. Certainly there's a lot of intricacies that play in, but the technology is going to continue to get better. And certainly if we can complement human and AI, I think it's going to help us all move to a higher standard.
I want to hear Artur and Jeff's take on that, Nancy, but when you say that, I think of like an exploratory AI, and those problems are actually harder to solve than the robotic screening or abstraction piece, because search, if you want to call it that, is kind of an infinite problem. Once you have your set of records, thinking about Robby's presentation, even if you have a ton of records, you're narrowing in on them. It's a finite problem. With search, it's an infinite problem, and you never know if you actually had that perfect search. You can evaluate the effectiveness or the accuracy of an AI when you're screening. You know, you have all those metrics Jeff was mentioning on the platform, like recall or precision, and you can quantify them. I don't even know how you quantify how effective an exploratory AI is on search, for instance. That is almost like an infinite problem. But I'm excited to see how, not just LaserAI and NK solve this, but how this industry in general is going to solve it, because I actually think that is a much broader question than just evidence synthesis. And drug discovery relies on this, and there's a ton of really cool AI drug discovery companies that have come out. I know our board member called me excitedly one day. It's like, I just found out about the coolest company. They're doing AI drug discovery. It's going to bring down the cost of discovering a drug by 90%. And it's like, well, okay, how do you evaluate that, right? How do you even measure the effectiveness of that AI? So yeah, Artur or Jeff, I don't know if you have insight.
I mean, So I think just from a UX perspective, one of the most frustrating things to me is just how slow it is right now. So machine learning can be really fast if you're doing it. Like our screening robot is just running on our server, no problem. But when we do our tag recommendations, we're calling out to this large language model on a different server, which we don't entirely control, or we just kind of have to pay for, right? And that takes a while. And so that slows down the iterative process. And I find that so frustrating. And I would love to design around those constraints and figure out a way to make that faster. And that's something that we're just obviously continuously working on. But even beyond that, obviously we want to enable researchers, consultants, these downstream customers in pharma and beyond to be able to interact with our platform and do that iterative process. I really think that those skills are going to be what's in high demand when it comes to interacting with these platforms in the very near future. As we move away from a lot of the rote exercises of like, okay, I have to extract all of this data, it's going to take months, and we make that process faster. How do we make sure that you are still getting the absolute best work out of that literature, right? So it's really interesting. So Robby, you were talking about, first of all, living systematic reviews, right? Where you've got basically, the way you're gonna explore that problem is you're just going to screen as many records as possible, but then you're going to take the top end of the best studies or whatever based on AI, and you're going to screen those ones, and you're just going to have to cut it off at a certain point, right? One of the decisions we had to make really early on when we were designing our screening model is that we had to decide, do we want to favor kind of inclusions, like false inclusions, or false exclusions? Because it's going to make a decision, and it's just going to make this determination. And we ended up favoring false inclusions because very purposely, because we thought false exclusions is going to be more harmful. Could have gone the other way. There's justifications for either direction, either design decision. But it's really important that our users kind of understand that side of things and some of the decisions that we've made. So we have to communicate that to them in the platform through this interface and through our materials as we teach them. And that is tricky, right? So there's these skills that people are going to have to learn. And ultimately, what you're really trying to understand fundamentally is how these models are working on the back end to help you, so that you can then do that iterative process, so that you can refine your protocol, your research question, your study design overall. Anyway, that's my answer. A little all over the place. Artur, go ahead.
Yeah, so great point on kind of telling apart search and review, really. I mean, with search, we technically look at different metrics, right? Because we look like on top K precision, and plainly speaking, this is all about the thing that nobody looks beyond the first page of results, which we know very painfully with all the search engine optimization that all the websites do. While of course here we are mostly concerned about the sensitivity or recall, as you said. So it's really a different kind of problem, and for the same reasons, it's not necessarily that the solutions will be the same, especially that with large language models, kind of going back to this exploratory scenario, we have this Socratic problem that we don't know what they don't know, right? These models are so big and so really impenetrable in terms of their capabilities that we would need, and people do this, we need to employ one model to interrogate this other model to explore this boundary of knowledge, and it's pretty much impossible to tell. And this is, I think, something that also applies to people. I mean, if you ask me about something and I give you an answer, then how do you know whether I'm really, and I'm speaking in the best faith? How do you know if this is some misconception, something that I maybe misread or don't remember correctly? This is the same as with these models. So what I'm particularly concerned about this exploratory use case is that, in general, all these models are some sort of a very large compression devices. So they take the very large amounts of input data and they try to compress them. And the thing about compression is that you try really to pick up the patterns that appear the most, right? So when kind of trying to brainstorm things or ask questions, as we have about domains such as health equity or acceptability, I'm just concerned that when we just rely on large language models, voice of many of underrepresented communities may go unheard, and this is especially true if you look at the fact that these models are mostly trained on English, and it's not like the whole culture is written down in English, and many countries and their culture are simply not represented in these models because their literature is very scarce and it's not included in the training data sets. So so this is really what concerns me the most in terms of this exploratory application. But at the same time, this is a very active area of research, and hopefully, we will see some breakthroughs both in terms of how we measure these things, but also how we address these challenges.
Great answer. Yeah, could not agree more. It really feels like, when we first encountered these large language models in the form of like ChatGPT, it kind of took the world by storm. It felt like magic because it was sufficiently advanced, right? But as you start to play around with those tools, you start to encounter its limitations pretty quickly, especially the early days. You're like, oh, okay, this actually can't replace me or do my job. And I think your point about it being something that is basically choosing the most likely path is actually sometimes really counterproductive. We kind of want something, especially when you're thinking about iterating on a really complex study design, like you would in one of our platforms. You really need to broaden that question before you can narrow it, and so that you can really capture the full picture there. So. Great point. Really like that. Just a reminder to the audience out there, we're kind of coming up on time here, but you can still squeeze in another question for either our guests today or the co-founders of these two platforms. So feel free to just ask away, and I'll try to squeeze your question in as we close in on the end of this hour here. One last question, I think, again, just for anybody. I think we can open this up to all four of you. Where are we headed with these tools and with this process? What do you see coming in the next, year, next 3 to 5 years, next decade, in terms of AI in its role in evidence synthesis? Let's start with Robby. We haven't heard from him in a while.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. No, that's a very good question and a hard one to answer, perhaps. But I think I want to come back to something Keith said. So in the end, it's about effects on decision making. So you can try many different things. You try to figure out how useful it is. Maybe you have iterative trials. How much does the human still need to add to this, and how much can the AI take over? I think in the end, groups like us, we are going to look at this and say, okay, what's the evidence that it really makes a difference? And just it's hard for me to know where it's going, but of course, from our team's perspective and our work's perspective, it would be great if more of this will be automated, right? So screening and data extraction, maybe even analysis, I'm not sure. But that would free up some of the time from our research team members to do other types of tasks, which could be called quality control for these processes, maybe methods development. So I think that's something we would definitely be looking forward to. And just to give one example in terms of how to figure out what works and what the consequences are of what you mentioned in terms of being precise versus making some other decisions. I think it really depends on the question that your objective. So if we take our example for our baseline risk studies for any type of outcome, we have many studies, so missing one or two may not be consequential. However, if you're looking for clinical trials that compare to treatments, and by taking a certain approach, you miss one out of the 3 trials that are out there, it may be very consequential. So I think just, it really depends on what you're trying to do.
Great answer. Nancy.
I would agree with Robby in that I think it's going to be very use case dependent. I think with this technology, we're going to see continued enhancements and the technology continue to get better, just like we are in other AI applications. I suspect we'll see AI being more proficient sooner with analyzing things that are traditionally designed. For instance, a 2-arm clinical trial where we've got our main intervention, we've got a comparator, we've got a primary endpoints, we've got a secondary endpoints. I foresee AI getting more sophisticated quicker with helping us to assess some of that information than perhaps with some of the retrospective work I do, where I'm pulling in clinical trials, I'm pulling in retrospective studies, I'm pulling in surveys. And so I've got a lot of different research designs that I'm trying to simulate together. So I foresee we'll see iterative improvements. I'm really looking forward to that. I mean, if AI can help me more quickly to align primary and secondary endpoints and adverse effects across studies, as well as efficacy outcomes, that can allow me to spend more time on some of the nuanced, which is not as straightforward. So I think we'll see iterative approaches, and I really welcome iterative approaches. Anything that AI can do to help me block and tackle that which is more structured will leave more time for me to, apply the human-centered approach to that which is more nuanced.
Great. Artur, go ahead. What do you think? Future?
Yeah, so I think that we are really onto something in terms of delegating, as Robby said, reading and extraction of data. I mean, we still have many decisions in the process that are more based on judgments. And here you probably kind of read in the press about the culture wars, the different companies putting out chatbots like Gemini, and OpenAI, and Twitter's Groks. And now it's no longer about the accuracy, but about some sort of a cultural or political agenda that is kind of circulated by all these bots. So it's all, kind of. I think we need to stick to science and to really make these more like agents that do very well-defined tasks that can be also audited and that have very well-defined inputs and outputs. But of course, people will start building like fully automated scientists, and you know that this already happens, that we have fully automated labs. So we have companies that have robots that design experiments, conduct experiments, and analyze data from experiments, and they will also publish the results of these experiments. So at some point, this will probably get us to such growth rate in terms of the publications that we'll also have robots that synthesize all this knowledge, because it will simply get out of hand. So I can see this clearly. I don't know how much time we have until this happens, but again, I think it will be more on the, let's say, production side. So we'll see so much data being produced that we'll need to automate more to cope with all this data.
Right. Well, I mean, forget robots doing it. We have so many human beings publishing so much literature every year. It's just more and more every year. Robby knows, right? That's a lot of screening decisions to make, right? When you're trying to think about what should actually be included in your study. So could not agree more, Artur. Keith, last but not least, what do you think? Future of AI in evidence synthesis.
I see a bifurcation coming, and I'm going to speak specifically about health economics and outcomes research. Nancy is fairly representative of what our user base is, which is like 80% health economists or in adjacent fields. I see a bifurcation coming between what is going to HTA bodies and what is for evidence generation planning or more informal use cases. And this is kind of what Nancy was saying around like, well, I sometimes do an NK project just because I'm curious about something I found in my other NK project. And it's not like a client deliverable. It's not even necessarily going to end up in an HTA, but it's just something that I do for my own edification. And I think that these bodies are going to come out with standards for what ends up in their submissions that are still largely human driven. But I think the sort of scoping aspect or any sort of gap analysis or anything that isn't a formal submission, anything that doesn't actually have to have that quality control, is going to very swiftly become mostly AI. Not all, but mostly AI. So I actually see a sort of bifurcation coming in the industry. Yeah, we'll see. I hope that terminology emerges to differentiate between these. For instance, like systematic literature review to me implies that a human looked at every record, whereas a targeted literature review or an AI literature review or a scoping review implies to me that at this point an AI did most of your work for you. But I don't think the community has really come around to that exact terminology. So we'll see how it all shakes out. I hope that one of these bodies comes out and clarifies for everyone so that we can all kind of rally around it. And use that terminology and use those standards, but hasn't happened yet. So maybe like ICER or ISPOR or NICE can do that for us.
Okay, nice. Yeah, so that's basically the end of this hour. I just want to thank, first of all, LaserAI for joining in this webinar with us at Nested Knowledge. I also want to thank our guests, Robby and Nancy. Thank you so much for presenting today and answering some questions. So yeah, I think that's a wrap. Thanks to all of our audience members for watching as well. Don't hesitate to reach out to either of us and either companies or our guests and ask any questions you might have still after the end of this hour. But yeah, thanks everybody, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks everyone.
My pleasure.